cloud. All right. So population in cities. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to interrupt. Also, feel free to dump it in the chat as you see fit. But I think you guys will find this sort of two-part lecture interesting because I think this this quote really says it nicely from Wilbur Zielinski. He's an author and a geographer. He says, the problem that shakes our confidence in the perpetuation and enrichment of civilized human existence, or even our biological survival, is that one of growth, the rate, volume, and kinds of growth, and whether they can be controlled in an intelligent, purposeful fashion. And I think Mr. Zielinski here has a fantastic point about humans. We've grown and we've grown and we've grown, but how we grow really is the problem, I think. Well, not I think, I know, but it really is the problem sort of with the way we've been growing, especially within the past 30 years, because what we'll collectively call the J curve, you'll see it's really really stark thing happening in recent times. So let's dive into the class, but let's start off with some basic population sort of definitions here. So we can collectively ask, what is a population? And that's pretty straightforward. The scientific definition simply defines it as a set of individuals of the same species living in the same region or habitat. So, the human population of planet Earth, or you could say the population of Boston or the population of New York City, whatever you want to say. You just define an area, and all the things living that are the same species in that area is a population. So pretty easy to understand definition. For instance, we have a population of seals living on this beach. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, we can also ask the question, what is a species? And that's a loaded question. And I know that might seem like, oh, species, that's so easy, but it's actually a really hard question to answer. But the best answer I can give you without spending an entire class talking about what a species is simply what we call the biological species concept, where we say a species is a group of individuals that are capable of breeding and producing viable offspring. Now, what does viable offspring mean? Well, offspring that can then go on to produce offspring for the next generation. So, for instance, when a horse and a donkey come together, they can mate and they produce an offspring. This offspring is called a mule. You could also think of like a tiger and a lion, right? They come together, they produce a liger. However, a liger and a mule as hybrids between two species are actually sterile. So that sort of definition of keeping a non-viable offspring, i.e. one that can't produce offspring, really is sort of the easiest way to think about what a species is. But you can also think about there is some issues with that. And again, I'm not going to go into it because, again, whole class about what a species is, and that is beyond the point of this class. And again, the liger is a great example of what is not a species. Now, how do we define the structure of a population, right? And when I say structure, I actually just kind of mean structure, right? What does it look like from top to bottom? What is it composed of? And we think about these through the lenses of sex. So, biologically speaking, so male, female. You can also think of it through the lens of gender, and there's quite a bit of diversity in terms of genders and things of that matter. But you can also think about it, that might be a difficult thing to do in populations such as the Kobudai fish, sorry. And this actually kind of interesting fish. It can swap genders and sexes at will. It's kind of a fascinating fish. And there's no shortage of animals that have the capacity to be swap sexes. So I'm sure you guys probably all saw Finding Nemo. Finding Nemo is a great example of fish that could swap sexes at will. So sex is good, but you have obviously weird organisms that can swap sex. You also have organisms that don't have any sex, which again, I think is a weird thing as well. Now, sort of the easiest one to think about is actually age. Age is pretty straightforward. You follow a cohort. What age do those individuals die at? That is what we think about for age structure. And you can also think of, and sort of a similar way you're thinking about for your lab, what age do individuals die at, right? So what different age classes are people living to, as you, again, probably saw in your lab that you're doing. So. And then we have size. Now, size is not super useful for humans or for most mammals, but it's pretty handy for things like plants, where they really, age really isn't a big deal. They just simply grow larger and larger and larger till they likely fall over, in which case they die. So size is kind of a good thing. But ultimately, all these things are an interplay between birth, death, as well as movement rates. And this varies as a sort of a function of all these three categories above: age, sex, and size. So lots of things go into telling us about a population overall. You can apply these to any species on the planet as a whole. Now, if we sort of look across different species, and this could be humans to mice or kangaroos to elephants, it doesn't really matter. All animals have different what we call biotic potential. And when we sort of grossly define biotic potential, there we go, because words are hard apparently. It varies between species. Now, when we define it, it's overall is something that basically defines what is your maximum birth rate, i.e., how much can you produce if resources were not an option, i.e., how many humans could I produce in 100 years if resources and death kind of weren't an issue. So what goes into biotic potential? Well, there's some math, and that may or may not excite you depending on what your feelings are about math. But we can use models to describe things including birth rate as well as death rate. And we, as you saw in your cemetery demography lab, we can define these as deaths per 1,000 individuals per year. It's a pretty common way of expressing this. And again, you'll express it like this way in your lab as well. But again, the mathematical model simply indicates what is the balance between birth and death. And that's really sort of the easiest way to think about how populations change. Now, how fast the birth rate is and how fast the population dies really reflects the biotic potential. So things that have a very, very high birth rate typically have very, very high biotic potential. And we can see that in our friendly mouse here. We have the population of individuals on the Y in their breeding cycle on the X. And you could see we go from 2 to 10 to 50 to 250, all the way up to 6,200 after simply 5 generations of breeding. And, for mice, that's pretty quick, right? For humans, that's, 100 years, but for mice, that's, a couple months, right? They have a much faster reproductive potential than we do. Now, this curve, which we'll collectively define as the J curve, because it looks like a J. You could also say backwards L, but people really just call it the J curve, is pretty consistent of a group of organisms, which we'll define in a little bit, but they encompass things like mice and weedy organisms such as weeds, such as dandelions, which I think dandelions are nice. I never really thought of them as weedy, but people call them weedy nonetheless, as well as things like spotted knapweed, mice, rats, cockroaches, things like that, things that have what we collectively call a high biotic potential. And we really just talked about that. So, and just the final thing before we move on, what we're really seeing here is what we would call exponential growth, right? That J curve is just a fancy way, or I guess not so fancy way of saying exponential growth, right? Because this is simply an exponential curve. You could fit an exponential model to this curve, because that would be fun, because obviously math is fun. So clearly, exponential growth looks fun, right? I mean, this looks like a crazy way to grow, right? But we know that whether it's humans or whether it's mice, there's a limit to essentially the amount of resources present, right? There's only so much resources out there that sort of put a cap on our friend here, exponential growth, and that J curve. So why can't exponential growth last? And there's really a couple of issues, and these apply to humans, and they also sort of don't apply to humans in some way, shape, or form. But ultimately, we have resources. Now, resources are pretty commonly defined across numerous species, but they include things like space, right? If everything, I shouldn't say everyone, needs physical space to survive. We need nutrients, right? We need food, right? We need water. We need all those sort of things that make up our biological sort of material. So resources are the big one. And that's the thing that happens sort of mostly early on, right? Resources in terms of, food typically limit population growth. Now, once that becomes scarce, individuals begin to starve, or they simply cannot find any level of habitat. Now, once resources do become scarce, we start to have things like aggression, disease, as well as competition. And now competition can be put as either interspecific or intraspecific. So interspecific meaning between species, i.e. mouse and a rat competing with one another, or intraspecific, i.e. two mouses competing with one another. And so the sort of the reality of these sort of three things, they're and as well as the fourth, which is increased pressure from predation, these are all what we would classically define as density dependent factors. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, the more dense your population becomes, the more likely these are to eventually set in. Now, this is why exponential growth simply cannot last. So if that's how what exponential growth looks like, i.e. the J curve, what does a more logistic or logical growth look like for a population? Again, population being either humans or anything else for that matter. Now, the sort of the more logical growth here is simply just called logistic growth, or the S curve, because again, it looks just like an S here, where we have abundant rapid growth, and it would be exponential growth, but not as exponentially fast as the J curve. Eventually leading us to a plateau, and this plateau is what we collectively define as K, or the carrying capacity. Now, the carrying capacity is an interesting number, and it varies pretty wildly between species. It does quite a bit, actually. So the carrying capacity is simply the maximum number of individuals a given area can sustain. Right. So if I have a park, there's a maximum number of resources that a park could sustain in terms of the population of, say, squirrels. Right. There's only so much nuts for the squirrels to get. There's only so many trees and little nooks and crannies for squirrels to get into. Right. And there's only so much water. Right. So that's what we're really thinking about the carrying capacity. What is the maximum individuals an ecosystem can sustain? But when I say sustain, I actually mean this in a sustainable fashion, i.e. sustain indefinitely. Right. So when we talked about sustainability, it was always sustainable for the long term. And that's the same thing for the carrying capacity. What can it sustain indefinitely? Because areas can sustain very high populations for a short period of time, but not indefinitely. So let's talk about some of the things that happens that help control populations, what impacts our carrying capacity. And the first one is, as I mentioned, these density dependent factors. And these are basically relying around resources, i.e. food, space, mates, things like that. And density dependent canonically includes things like disease, competition, as well as predation. And they simply function as in a density dependent fashion. So the more dense a population is, the more likely are these things to happen. Now, to give you an example of how this works, we'll use COVID as a great example of this, because for those of you that live in Massachusetts, you know some of the hardest hit areas in Massachusetts, such as Lynn, Revere, East Boston, have some of the highest population densities in the entire state. And so we see this disease of COVID, and it's spreading, at least it did in the past, spread relatively rapidly through these very, very high density areas, leading to much higher infection rates and potentially more deaths. And that's in contrast to, say, something like, maybe like way out in Orange, Massachusetts, right? Way west Massachusetts, basically New Hampshire, Vermont. Oops, I did not mean to do that. I hit a button. I don't know what button I hit. Hold on a sec. Let me just fix that. Where we look at something like Orange, Massachusetts, really not very densely populated, very, very low COVID-19 incidence rates. So again, the more dense your population is, and I mean dense as in like a lot of individuals in a small area. I don't mean it as in like stupid. I had someone ask me that once, and I thought it was really funny. So I always like to mention it. But really dense populations more likely to have these density dependent factors, because you're simply more likely to be eaten. You're more likely to compete for space. You're more likely to catch a disease if there's more people or more individuals around. Then we have density independent factors. Now, these are collectively just chance events, and they don't really care how dense your population is. They affect your population. You could call these, natural disasters. You could call them God events, whatever you want to call them. They're essentially, doesn't matter how dense you are, you're going to be impacted by this issue, right? Whether it's a flood, a storm, a fire, an avalanche, any natural disaster. You can also think maybe like a human-induced disaster, like a nuclear bomb or something like that, or like a bomb. That would be a kind of a good anthropogenic density independent factor. But these things essentially limit your population regardless of how dense it is, right? So if a flood comes through, it doesn't matter how dense your population is, the flood's going to affect your population, right? I don't know if you guys saw the giant flood in Germany that's happening right now from all those rains, but just amazing the amount of these huge rainwaters that are coming through and just decimating these small towns. And it's, again, obviously a very terrible thing, but from a biology context, it didn't really matter how dense the town was. It just simply acted in a fashion to hurt said town. And that's what we're really getting at here with density independent population growth. Now, when we sort of just go back to this slide where we have a J curve and an S curve, we have two distinct types of growth, and there are two distinct types of individuals that actually encompass those two growth patterns. Now, the two types of individuals we'll discuss have canonically been deemed K and R selected species, or K and R adapted species. It really doesn't matter. The terms are used interchangeably in the biology world. I always end up saying R selected species, but this figure obviously says R adapted species. So it doesn't really matter what sort of term you use to define them, selected or adapted, that means the same thing. So now our adapted species or our selected species, they have these sort of 8 characteristics. They have a very short life, rapid growth of the individuals, leading to early maturity, producing many small offspring with essentially zero parental care. The cool thing about things that are adapted or are selected, they are adapted to unstable environments. So you could think of like a dandelion growing in a crack of a sidewalk. That's a really unstable environment, and dandelions like that type of an environment. You could also think of mice are the same way. Mice will go pretty much anywhere, including like sewers, right? Really, really unstable environments. Typically speaking, they are prey, though there are some R-adapted species that are predators, but again, mostly preys. And they're what we collectively call a niche generalist. Now, niche, or sometimes people call it niche. I don't like niche. I like niche. Sounds better to me. Niche or niche, whatever you want to call it. A niche is essentially like what do you do on an everyday basis, right? What resources do you use? What space do you use? What do you eat? Where do you go? How do you breed? All that stuff. Basically, what an organism does is what it's called its niche or niche, whatever you want to call it. So these are our adapted species. Again, they follow that J curve, rapid population growth, allowing them to adapt to and exploit unpredictable environments and increase in population very rapidly as resources become available to them. And the classical example again is the mouse. Everyone knows mice breed like crazy. You know, they're everywhere. They eat anything, right? Mice are the sort of the classic example here. Our other type of species is actually going to be our K-selected species or K-adapted species. And this is pretty much where we fall into. We have, typically speaking, for this group of species, we have long lives, slower growth, very late maturity, few larger offsprings with a pretty high amount of parental care. You know, I think humans are a great example of that. It takes us over a decade to reach sexual maturity. When we do raise children, we put a high degree of parental investment into our children for about 18 years, right? Sometimes less, depending on how crappy of a parent you are, I guess. Now, organisms that are K-adapted are typically adapted to stable environments. Generally speaking, they're predators, but as it sort of notes here, spruce trees and elk are not predators. They are herbivores. So you can be K-selected or adapted and be a prey, a prey item or potentially a photosynthetic organism. So it's not limited to just being a predator like the majestic brown bear over here. And then finally, they are what we call niche specialists. And so again, a niche being all the things that an organism does in its average everyday life. Organisms like bears, they do a limited number of things. And again, that's in contrast to a mouse, which does crap tons of things in the environment around. So we have these two distinct species where K-selected species tend to be found only in stable and undisturbed areas. Again, why is that? Again, they only could do a limited number of things in the environment. They really do. And when we're thinking about logistic growth, that's typically the type of growth that our K-selected species will demonstrate on an average every yearly basis. Now, this is in contrast to the R-selected species that have very rapid reproduction, very, very high biotic potential, and they'll typically have this really sort of interesting growth pattern, which I'll just show you as opposed to saying it aloud, where we have population size here on the Y, time on the X. Obviously, time progresses from here to here, where we have that really rapid J-curve growth, carrying capacity of K here. It overshoots the population, crashes down, overshoots, crashes, overshoots, crashes. They have these sort of boom bust cycles where we have very, very high amounts of population growth leading to a crash in population growth. Now you might ask yourself, why does the population crash? Well, our density dependent factors kick in, right? Competition, lack of space, lack of resources kick in, causing lots of individuals to die off or be eaten by larger animals, causing their populations to crash below the carrying capacity, and then for them to rinse and repeat the cycle over and over again. Sometimes they come to an equilibrium where they just kind of settle into their carrying capacity, but most populations like this have boom bust cycles over and over and over again. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Now, I'd like to give you I think a pretty cool example of this sort of growth and what it looks like naturally. And it's actually one of my favorite examples. I don't really know why. I just really like it. I learned about this when I was your age. I hate saying that, but it is true. I learned about it when I was in my early 20s. But the reindeer are kind of interesting. Now, in 1944, our friends of the Coast Guard transported about 29 deer to St. Matthews Island. It's an island in the archipelago of Alaska. I'm sure you guys probably have seen pictures of Alaska. Huge, huge island chain coming off the tip of Alaska. There's hundreds and hundreds of islands there. They're pretty cool little islands. Just as a note, if you ever have the chance to go to the Alaskan archipelago, I recommend it. It's very, very beautiful. So, all right. So this is what we have. 29 reindeer introduced in 1944. By 1957, there was 1,300 reindeer. By 1963, there was close to 6,000 reindeer, so that we sort of hit our maximum capacity here. And then by 1966, they can only find 42 reindeer. And then fast forward to about 14 years after that, there was 0 reindeer on the island. So I think you guys probably have a general idea what's happening here, but rapid J-curve growth reaching some maximum, and then the population just crashing. And again, that's basically what we just saw in this previous slide. Rapid J growth, overshooting, reaching a maximum, and then crashing. But unlike the mouse population here in this example, our deer population completely just crashes out. So we can ask the question, why did it completely crash out? Why didn't it not sort of rebound the way a mouse does? Well, I think there's two sort of key ideas to take away from this. The first is the size of the reindeer, right? Reindeer are large. They are case-selected species. So they simply do not have the capacity to do this, right? They simply don't. Mice do because they reproduce really fast, but reindeer, like humans, they don't reproduce very fast. So if their population crashes and it crashes hard, they're simply not going to be able to rebound the way a mouse could. Now, the other sort of takeaway from this is, why did they crash? Well, the cool thing here is it's actually an interplay between density independence and density dependent factors. So let's talk about what those are. Now, on this island, one of the primary food sources for this deer is actually a lichen. Lichen are one of my favorite groups of organisms on the planet. If you've never heard of a lichen before, they're really, really cool. They're fungus, and inside the fungus, there's an algae. So they're photosynthetic. So they're pretty dang cool. You've seen lichen before. If you've seen a rock in Boston or maybe in your backyard or a tree, and it's got like green or white on it, it kind of looks like bird poop. That's a lichen. And you might not think those are miraculous species or anything. I do, but they are really, really cool. So if you've never heard of a lichen, I recommend you Google what a lichen is, all the cool things lichen do, because again, they are really, really fantastic organisms. Now, this is a lichen. Now it's green. It was actually one of the primary food sources for the deer on this island. Islands have a relatively limited amount of resources because they're islands, right? I'm sure you guys have probably seen like, oh, we're trapped on a desert island. There's no water or food for us, right? Why is that? Well, islands have low amounts of resources. So the primary resources for the deer on this island was this beautiful, beautiful lichen. Now, What happens if you increase your population to 6,000 deer on a relatively small island? Well, those deer are going to be hungry. They're going to eat, eventually till they eat their entire food source, i.e. the lichen. Now, that's the first thing that happened. So you can imagine more deer, more eating. They're competing with each other for the lichen. That's density dependence. They're losing their resource. Then we have the sort of the terrible parts about Alaska, which is their monstrous storms. I'm sure you guys probably know the Arctic is no joke, no joke at all. So you have something like Alaska has these monster snowstorms, and these monster snowstorms, as being density independent factors, will come in, both hurt the reindeer as well as hurt the food source for the reindeer. So we have these two sort of factors interplaying with one another. We have the reindeer being affected by their food source disappearing in competition, i.e. density dependence. And then we have these density independent factors, such as storms, again, pretty common in Alaska, leading to the overall destruction of the reindeer population, but more importantly, leading to the destruction of the reindeer's principal food source. Now, there's an interesting thing about lichen is that they grow really, really slow. And so because lichen go really, really slow, they're actually very, very unlikely to recover from a disturbance such as being overeaten or a monster snowstorm. So sort of a double-edged sword here for these reindeer. First, they basically killed off their food source, and then eventually their food source simply could not recover, and they could not recover because of the horrible, horrible storms that you find in Alaska. So kind of a cool little scenario here between density dependence and density independence. Density dependence and density independence, two factors, again, act independently, but can act synergistically to help limit population growth. Now, this leads us to survivorship curves, and this is directly sort of getting at your labs and what you're doing for your labs, because for those of you that have started your labs, you know that you're constructing survivorship curves. Now, what is a survivorship curve? Well, it's simply a plot where we look at different age classes here on the x-axis here. So young to old. So in your case, your age classes would be like 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, and so on and so forth. And then the number of survivors. Now, this is a logarithmic scale. You don't need to make a logarithmic scale, but you certainly are going to be plotting on your y-axis the number of survivors per 1,000. So you took that percentage and you multiplied it by 1,000 to get your survivors per 1,000. So what do we end up getting? Well, there's three distinct types of survivorship curves that we can see spread across nature. They don't really deviate from this all too much. Now, type 1, which is typically characteristic of our K-selected species, where there's very high survivorship to old age, as is denoted by the shape of this curve. As this curve sort of dips down, or any of these curves dips down, it means less individuals are alive, right? So when we look at type 1, there's very early on and up until sort of middle age, there's pretty high survivorship. But as we get to old age, survivorship goes down very, very rapidly. So type 1, which again is characteristic of humans, also characteristic of all other K-selected species, leads us to a type 1 curve. Again, very, very low mortality early on, high mortality late in life. Now, that's our first type. Now, type 2 is characteristic of a various group of organisms. It's not like one specific thing like K-selected or R-selected. It's kind of a mixed mash of K-selected and R-selected species. Now, this graph tells you it's lizards, and that would be absolutely true, but it's also something we see in birds and fish as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag of things. But type 2 curve, it doesn't really matter how old you are, you're likely to die. It's kind of I know that's kind of a nihilistic way of putting it, but that's really what the type 2 curve really tells us, because you're likely to die young, you're likely to die as middle age, and you're likely to die as old age, as denoted by the shape of this curve, which is simply just a downward line, right? Everything has to die, and that's just sort of the reality of nature. However, as we see with our lizard friends here, the type 2 ones, it doesn't really matter how old they are, they're equally likely to die. There's lots of things that go into giving something of type 2 curves. Just as a note, it's not like like just a specific group of organisms. Lots of sort of things about the size of the organisms and the way they hunt for food and all that stuff go into shaping a type 2 curve. And then the final curve is our type 3 curve. This is pretty characteristic of our selected species, where you have very, very high early mortality with very few individuals living to be old age. So again, you can see that it's really easy to see with this sort of characteristic, really rapid drop during young age with very, very few individuals living to be old age overall. So these are our 3 types of curves: 1, 2, and 3. Again, how you interpret them is when are things likely to die? Type 1, they're likely to die when they're old. Type 2, it doesn't matter how old they are. And type 3 is death early on. Now, when you guys are doing your graphs for your survivorship curves, because humans are case selected species, you are most likely to only see this type of curve. If you see another type of curve, don't be surprised. Sometimes you just kind of get funky data, and it happens. But again, I expect and anticipate most of you to get this type of curve. But if you don't worry. Just give me the curves that you have, and you don't need to worry about that. So, all right. So this is how natural populations grow. This is what survivorship looks like. So let's talk a little bit about human populations. Where do we stand? We hover in the area of about 7.4, 7.5, 7.6 billion people, which is just an astronomically huge number of individuals. It really is. Like 1 billion people is a lot of people, especially when it's 7.5-ish billion people. Now, in terms of how much we grow each year, we add about 85 million people each year to the planet. And projections show that by 2050, we're likely to hit about 9.7, 9.5 billion, depending on who you ask, if we continue on our current trajectory. Again, if it's business as usual. That's kind of a scientific term, not a scientific term, but that's a term you'll hear scientists say all the time. If nothing changes, i.e. business as usual, this is what will look like by 2050. I will make mention of just two quick things. Some people project we'll hit bigger numbers. Some people think we'll hit 12 billion. Some people think we'll hit lesser numbers. We'll hit like 8 billion, but the consensus seems to be in that 9.5 billion range. And the other thing I want to make mention of is actually some people don't think we're going to hit 9.5 billion. We're going to hit 9 billion because of economic inequality. That's sort of one of the sort of interesting research things that's come out about population growth in the past couple of years. So take with that however you'd like. It's up, you can believe whichever number you want, because we really won't know until we really get there. Yep, you had a question, Nick?
Just a quick one. What did I guess there's things like health and literally just food and things like that, but is that the reasons why economic inequality would affect population growth?
Well, I mean, so you could. It's actually pretty. It's kind of a sort of a double thing, right? So one of the resources humans need is obviously food, right? But we also need we're sort of a unique thing, right? We need stimulations, right? We need to feel unlike animals where they just live in nature, right? We need to feel comfortable, right? We need to be entertained, right? We sort of are a unique species in that fashion. A lot of people think a lot of economic inequality that we're seeing both here and abroad is leading people to be more uncertain about their future and thus less likely to want to have a child, right? If you don't think you can afford a child, if you're using, I would say, probably logic, you're less likely to have a child, right? So if you're working, a minimum wage job, making, I don't know, Massachusetts is what, $13 in that ballpark? I can't remember. You're only making so much money, so you're less likely to essentially roll the dice and have a kid if you make less money. And one thing that has certainly been clear from recent years is how much the inequality has been growing, especially during large scale events like the pandemic and the recession of 2008. It's simply that a gap between the sort of the poorest and the wealthiest is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had done a project on that. I just didn't think about why it would affect population growth, but that makes sense.
Yeah, it's kind of a sad thing to think about. We can actually see the effects of some of that actually here in the United States. So the United States has seen some of its lowest population growths in generations since the baby boomer age. And a lot of economists and sociologists think, again, it's because of some growing economic inequality here, which is, take whatever you'd like from that. Okay, so great question, by the way. It's a good sort of thing to think about, sort of why humans are unique, because a lot of things we discuss together here are not just unique for humans, but also are shared. But there are some definitely unique human challenges, right? Mice don't go to work, right? Not in the same way that we do, right? Mice don't have the cognitive capacity that we do, right? So certainly a lot of things that make humans unique. So let's think about populations. Now we'll think about this in the context of the global population first. As we sort of mentioned, what balances global populations in terms of how much we grow on a year-to-year basis is simply a balance between how many people are born and how many people died. Right? More people that are born than die leads to an increase in population. If you have more deaths than births, that leads to a decrease in population. I think that's pretty straightforward. The more that comes in than leaves, right, that leads you to grow. Now, interesting, when we think about things locally, it starts to get, it's not really complicated, but it starts to add some new factors into the equation. So we could think about, again, that balance between birth and death. But when we think about a country like the United States, or we think about a country like Germany or Japan, one of the biggest sort of buoys for our populations, because our population growth has stagnated so much, is actually how many people come into this country, immigration, and how many people leave the country, how many people emigrate from this country. When we think about the United States, we think about Japan, we think about Germany, population growth, and these sort of, I guess you could call them modern. I don't know what the, I don't know really, I can't think of the best term for that. I guess more advanced economies. I guess maybe that would be the way. I don't know. I can't think of a good word for it, but I think you guys have a general idea what I'm talking about here. Countries that are, again, more like industrialists, like the United States, Germany, Japan, where population growth is very, very low. You're talking like sub 5% just from births, birth and death rate balance. They rely pretty heavily on immigration from other countries. So, for instance, in the United States, immigrants account, depending on what state you're in, upwards of 10% of the population. Some states it's higher. So for instance, like New Mexico, Texas, immigrants are much higher proportion of the population. But the United States alone, there's a decent chunk, 10 plus million people in the United States. So, like close to 3 to 5% of our population are immigrants, which is, a good thing. I always argue that diversity is a good thing. It doesn't matter what the context of diversity is. But a population that's more mature, like the United States, if it wasn't for immigration, our population would slow to essentially an unsustainable rate. And they're actually seeing this in Japan right now, where their population growth is so slow and the immigration is so slow, they're projecting it's going to impact their economy in the coming years. You might think, why is that the case? Well, the reality is you need people to be born, right? You need workers, right? You need people to fit into the economy in some shape or form. And if you don't have a high birth rate and you don't have a high immigration rate, your economies and your population, obviously, but those are obviously tied together, is going to suffer in some shape or form. So kind of an interesting thing. Now, we're going to talk more about population density in the second half of this class, but population density simply refers to the number of individuals of a species in a per unit area or volume, if we're thinking about the ocean or a lake or something like that, at a given time. So we can look at population density of the United States, and you guys have probably seen something similar to this. My favorite state to do this in is actually Nevada, because you can see, and as well as Utah. These are my two favorite states to sort of talk about this pattern, because when we look at sort of this map and the way it's laid out, the higher the peak, the higher the population density, i.e. the more people living in a defined area. And I like Nevada and Utah because they only have one peak. So Nevada, Utah, it's Salt Lake City. That's where most of the population of Utah lives. And then we have Nevada, which is we have Las Vegas, where that's the biggest bump, and then whatever the other big city in Nevada is, Rio. I don't know, whatever the other big city. I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. Again, but most of the states are flat. And that's really exacerbated here in these two states. But you look at something like California, which has about 1 in every 8 Americans lives in California. The entire state is basically a giant mountain with some areas that are relatively low. And you can see something similar, you know, in a state like Massachusetts, really high population density in the Boston area, but still pretty high density outside of the Boston area as well. And there's lots of cool things you can see from this map. You can also see the same type of trends globally, right? Where we have hotspots of cities. And we'll talk about cities in the second half of this lecture. But you can see lots and lots of hotspots in Africa and in China and India, as well as in the Pacific Islands. Lots of hotspots in cities. My favorite of all these sort of trends is actually Egypt, where you see the Nile River running from south to north in Egypt, where basically the entire population in Egypt lives on the Nile River, which I always thought was kind of cool. It's the Egyptians saying the Egypt is the gift of the Nile, and that really is heavily shown by the population density in Egypt as a thing. But this is what we're sort of seeing. Now, there's two sort of trends that we'll take away from this. The first is people like to live near water. Egypt is a great example of that, but as is the Mediterranean, as is along China and all its monstrous rivers that it has, or whether it's the ocean, right? Large populations in the Pacific Islands, around Lake Victoria in Africa, the Great Lakes here in the United States, doesn't really matter. People like to live near water. And that's important for, economy, right? Shipping and stuff like that, but also water as a resource, right? You want to live near Lake Victoria because there's water there and there's pretty much no water on the continent of Africa. I'm obviously joking about that. There's obviously water in Africa, but there's clearly not a ton of water on the continent of Africa. And the other sort of big key thing is that people like to live in cities, and we'll talk about why cities are so awesome and not awesome in the second half of today's class. So now we can actually start to look at the age structure of populations, and we'll do it in the sort of context of 3 hypothetical scenarios, and then we'll look at actual data in a second. But we can look at where we have an expanding population, a stable population, and then a declining population. And so expanding population would be like what we would see, say in most of Africa, where most of Africa is growing in terms of population size, where there's a very high number of people in pre-reproductive years, a high number of people in their reproductive years, and a smaller proportion of people in their post-reproductive years. This is in direct contrast to a stable population, which is not really seeing massive amounts of growth, where it's pretty thick all the way around, not very bottom heavy, not very top heavy. And then we can see a declining population where we have it's pretty narrow at the bottom and pretty thick around the middle and relatively wide around the top, especially relative to the base here. So 3 different types of populations that we can see in terms of age structure. And we could just give you 3 examples of this. So we have Nigeria, United States, and then Germany. This could also be Japan as well. Japan is the best example of a declining population because theirs is so stark, even relative to Germany's. So now we can look at rapid growth again, wide base, narrow top, slowing growth, but still growing, relatively sizable base, but very, very large middle girth here. And then it's still a sizable older population. And then we see again, declining growth, small population of young individuals, lots of middle people, lots and lots of old people as well. So 3 distinct demographic age structures of 3 different types of countries. Again, this is idealistic. This is what happens more so in practice, but they're not all that different than one another, right? These 3 look pretty similar to these 3. So I think that's kind of cool. Now, let's talk a little bit more about human population growth, and then we'll sort of talk about a few more things, but let's talk about how fast humans have grown. And we've already seen this this picture in our previous class, when I sort of pointed out to you guys that this little dip here is from the Black Death and stuff like that. So we've already sort of seen this, but I want to sort of just talk about the overall trajectory of this, because I think it's really a fascinating thing. Where we can look at where we had hunter gathering all the way up until about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. As well, I should say about to 8,000 years ago, and then mixed hunter gathering and agriculture up to about 4,000 years ago. And then the agricultural revolution really took off, where we started massively expanding how much food we could grow. And that, again, not so much of a population growth, right? We didn't dramatically change our population from 4,000 to 1,500, or I should say 0 BC, right? And we really don't start growing meaningfully up until modern times. So by the time 1800 rolls around, we're only at 1 billion people. But it takes us 130 years, so to 1930, to add another billion people, 30 years to add another billion people, 14 years to add another billion people, 13 years to add another billion people, 12 years to add another billion people. And then if my math is right, another 12 years to add another billion people. And that was in 2011. We've added about 500 million people in 10 years since then, which is pretty remarkable growth. Doubling your population every 10 or so years. And I think you guys can really see that we started off on more of a logistic growth here, and then we just smack dab hit that exponential growth. Now, we've talked about a little bit why that was, right? The Industrial Revolution took off, technology, better agriculture, antibiotics, medicines, so on and so forth, really drive this massive and rapid growth. But the question is, where do we end? How long do we keep going? Right? Do we stop at 8? Do we hit 10? Do we go to 16 like some people predict? The question is, what question we should ask, and I think everyone probably that thinks about these things asks all the time, how long can human population grow, and what limits our growth, and what has contributed to our rapid growth? So as we've sort of discussed, the agricultural and industrial revolution both allowed us to feed more people and allow us to derive medicines, more access to food and resources, longer lives, so on and so forth. That's sort of the biggest sort of thing. Technology. That's the one sort of major thing that sets us apart from man. Sets man apart from our wild brethren, right? Even our, ancestral extinct population of hominid like creatures like Neanderthals, right? What set us apart again at that time, even then, was our technology. More technology allows us to expand. So if you think about the state of Arizona, for instance, the state of Arizona pretty much only exists as a population because of air conditioning. No one wants to live in that 110-degree heat all summer, but why does the population of Arizona exist in such a large amount? Well, it's because of technology, air conditioning, which I will argue is the best technology ever invented, because summer heat sucks. I'm a New Englander, so I like winter stuff. So summer heat always sucks for me. So that's the sort of things that contributed to our stuff. Now, our population, as we sort of saw, it's growing, but the world population has been slowing, i.e. how much we've added, right? We're not projected to hit 8 billion people for quite a bit of time. So our population is slowed, but again, we're still adding about 85 million, or about 1.2% growth every year. Now, it is unevenly distributed. Of the 85 million people that are added to the world every year, 96% of those occur in underdeveloped or developing countries, such as those in Africa, as well as Southeast Asia. Now, the other thing which we'll spend the next part of class talking about is where that population growth has occurred, and most of that population growth has occurred in urban areas. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Now, the sort of the final thing I'll make a note of before we sort of move on to urbanization is, how long can the population keep growing? What sort of factors limit human growth? The reality is there's lots of things that might influence how long and how big the human population can grow. Do we develop new technologies, right, to help stave off problems, right? I think the COVID-19 vaccine is a great example of this. We had this worldwide pandemic. We developed a vaccine in spectacular fashion in about 8 months. I mean, there was lots of work that happened before that, but again, we developed a vaccine from start to finish in about 8 months. So technology really seems to be the escape for humans, and that technology can be simple as a vaccine, or maybe as extravagant as leaving the planet and going to Mars, though I don't think we're quite there, regardless of what Elon Musk will tell you about our capacity to go to Mars at this point in time. But one of the sort of the biggest things we actually think is going to be hurting human population growth is actually ecosystem balance. As we discussed, we rely so heavily upon our ecosystems and the health of those ecosystems to support our economy, to support our needs as individuals for resources, space, right? All the things that we need, water purification, air purification. So the reality is, what we ultimately think will limit human population growth is actually the health of our surrounding ecosystems. It's kind of bringing us full circle, right? We sort of use all this crazy technology to escape nature, but what we think is going to limit how much we can actually grow is nature, how much damage we do to nature. Now, when we start to analyze this problem, most of the rapid population growth, as we've mentioned, is happening in developing countries. It's not like countries like the United States or Germany or France or whatever. It's mostly in developing countries. We're also seeing pretty high amounts of overconsumption. And this is happening pretty extravagantly here in the United States, but it also is ramping up in China as well as in India. So that's kind of a big deal, right? Tragedy of the commons, as we discussed, overexploiting a resource. So the question we could ask is, what's gonna be the end results? And I think your guess is as good as mine at this point in time. What's going to limit population growth seems to be the environment, but how big we're going to grow, we really kind of don't know. So that's the first part of the section. Now there is some information here from your lab, but we already sort of went through your lab. If you want to know a little bit about some of the math that could have gone into what your lab does, I sort of left some things here for you guys if you want to take a peek at. But again, you as a lab in your lab is actually making this sort of curve all on your own. And we sort of discussed it in depth last class. So I won't go into your lab any more than we already have. So I'll leave that at that. If you want to take a peek at these last couple slides, because you think that might help you with your cemetery lab, have fun with it. But again, we talked about most about what you need for your lab at this point in time. So I won't beat that information into you guys any longer, because I'm sure you guys probably don't want that. So that leads us to the end of part one. Do you guys want to keep going, or do you want a 10-minute break, 5-minute break, 2-hour break? Well, 2-hour break would bring us to the end of class. But does anybody have any preference? We're going to talk about cities in a moment. Okay, we could take a 10-minute break. I'm a-okay with that. I have nothing left. I have nothing else to do for the remaining of the afternoon. So we'll come back together at 1:05. So take a few minutes for yourself, go to the bathroom, get a drink, do whatever you need to do, and we'll come back at 1:05. Be back, not as in bulk. Bulk. Oh my goodness, back. All right, so we'll be back in about 10 minutes. All right, so second half of today is going to be talking about cities. Now, as I sort of mentioned in the previous part, cities really are, as we sort of saw, I don't really need to tell you guys, but cities are really where populations are pretty heavily concentrated. And as we'll see, our cities are where population is growing. Now, I like this quote from these three people, and I can't even remember the book it's from or article. I don't remember where it's from. I actually like the quote, because we shape our cities and then our cities shape us. And that's kind of an interesting quote, right? We define what our cities are going to ultimately look like, but then our cities, as we sort of live in them for extended periods of time, they really start to define us both biologically as well as culturally. And I think it's pretty clear that the culture inside of a city is very, very much different than the culture outside of a city, as well as the health and the well-being and the pursuits and all the things about people living in cities and not in cities is pretty starkly different. So pretty interesting divide. Now, one of the things that our beloved Henry Ford. So you guys probably know Henry Ford is not the inventor of the automobile, but is certainly the inventor of the mass production and the assembly line fashion of making automobiles. Now, Ford back in the day, in the early 1900s, really saw cars as a way to escape the crowded cities, right? He really saw it as a car is not so much as just a way to get around a city, but more as a way for the average everyday person to leave the city, to escape what he saw as problems of the city, issues of the city, and to really get away from the city. And you actually can see this in the way he actually started changing the way he manufactured his cars. So he actually moved his company from Detroit to Dearborn, Michigan, back in the early 1900s. Dearborn, Michigan is a really interesting place. they have a really high density of people from the Middle East, like the highest in the entire country. And so it's a really different place in Michigan, because Michigan is overwhelmingly white working class individuals. But then you have Dearborn, which again is primarily folks from the Middle East, which means they have absolutely wonderful food. So if you're ever in the Detroit area, definitely swing by Dearborn for some awesome Middle Eastern food. Pretty cool town. Detroit's also a pretty cool city. It's kind of a weird city because there's boarded up buildings, but it's also a pretty fun city. Anyways, that's enough about my time when I lived in Michigan. So now, as we sort of discussed, most people, about 50% or more, depending on the country, live in a city, and it's pretty stark. It varies pretty heavily between country to country. You can look at a place like China, where upwards of 70% of their population lives within the confines of a city or very close to a city, and that's here in the United States, it's closer to around 45 to 50%. So it really depends on the country. Now, as you guys probably know, living both urban and not urban requires some level of infrastructure, right? Roads, buildings, parks, parking lots, things like that. They're required both in and out of a city, so it doesn't really matter where you go. Now, globally, urban, we're undergoing something that's been collectively called the urban transition, where people are becoming far more urban and far less rural. And one of the biggest declines in maybe not declines, but the biggest shift in the way people are getting money nowadays is actually the loss of farming. Farming is becoming less and less about the individual farmer and more about the corporate farmer or large scale farmer or industrial farmer, whatever you want to call it. It's kind of an interesting switch. And people are growing less food for themselves and for others, switching to be more living in a city life. And you can really see that pretty much everywhere, right? Even in Massachusetts, the Boston metropolitan area has about a third or so of Massachusetts population. Now, in 2008, we crossed the 50% mark, where the first time more people lived in urban areas than rural areas. So that was kind of a big thing. I'm sure you guys also probably know that the recession happened in 2008, so it caused a pretty dramatic shift in the way people were living their lives, anyways. And one of the big shifts was people moving into cities where there was, typically speaking, more employment available. But how do we define an urban area? Well, the technical definition really just comes at is places where people live in large numbers in relatively dense settlements and work in some non-agricultural job. And that agricultural job can be economics, finance, biology, chemistry, anything that's not agricultural in origin. That's sort of the broad textbook definition. And there's this really interesting fact, and I'm always dumbfounded when I see this fact. But collectively, the world cities add about 1 million people per week due to migration from rural areas, which I think is absolutely incredible when you think about it. That 52 million people every year move from the country to the city, which again I think is absolutely astonishing when you think about that volume of people getting up and moving from a countryside, from a suburban area into the city. I think it's kind of a weird sort of thing, but I like to think about things a lot. So that's just me. Now, interestingly, when we sort of start to think about the numbers, there are collectively more people living in the Tokyo metropolitan area than the total population of Earth about 6,000 years ago, when cities were just beginning to form. So I'm sure you guys know Tokyo's the largest. Is it still the largest city? I think it's still the largest city. One of the largest cities on the planet, at about 38 million plus people in the Tokyo metropolitan area. That's more people that lived in cities all the way back when cities were first becoming a thing. Now, cities as themselves tend to aggregate around trade and transportation hubs. So for instance, we talked about Detroit already. Detroit aggregated around the Great Lakes. Same thing with Chicago, right? Chicago's off Lake Michigan. We could think of Boston Harbor, New York, right? We could think of the great cities, San Francisco. Pretty much every large city, with some exceptions, obviously, has aggregated around some central trade and transportation hub. And even states that are in sort of inland, you can think of something like Indiana. Some of them, the largest cities in Indiana are not too far a drive from Lake Michigan. So again, transportation hubs, that's typically the center of both population structure as well as political power. Now, the first city to have more than 1 million people and I think this is a really fascinating thing, is London. And that happened in 1800. I'm sure you guys probably know, and as we sort of discussed, 1800 was about the sort of the middle of the Industrial Revolution. So people are moving into London for economic opportunity, which is kind of cool. And globally nowadays, about 25% of all people live in a city with more than 1 million people, which is kind of a crazy number to think about, at least for me. Now, by 2050, so, we sort of mentioned 2050 as like when we think human populations are going to plateau, we expect that urban populations will double from nowadays. So we're expecting huge numbers of people to be living in cities. So understanding a city is really sort of important for not only the current human population of about 50% of us, but also for the future population of human cities. So let's talk about what cities first do to the environment, because this is an environmental science course, right? So we got to talk about the bad things about cities as well as the good things about cities, but let's start off with some of the bad things. Now, cities, while they were great for concentrating people in a single area, right? We can think of an example here of the San Francisco, Oakland, Hayward metropolitan area of our friends over in California. That's the sort of the area that they're living in. Not a huge area, but their environmental impact is actually 48 times larger than their actual metropolitan area. So lots of people living in a small area, you might think, oh, great, it limits the amount of growing of impact on the environment. But the reality is, if you have that many people, they need resources. And where do those resources come from? Well, as of now, they come at the expense of the environment, at the expense of our ecosystem services. Now, the other aspect that comes with living in the city is actually relatively high resource use. So things like energy, things like waste production, and we'll talk about waste production later in the semester, but waste production is a huge problem of waste. What do you do with all the waste of, the 5 million people living in the San Francisco metropolitan area, right? How do you deal with the 10 million, the 38 million people in Tokyo and all the waste they generate and all the energy they need and all the food they need? So the ecological impact of a city is significantly larger than the footprint of the city itself. Now, I don't want you to think that, making a city is not inherently bad for the environment, right? To make San Francisco area, you had to destroy a bunch of land. So there is an impact directly, but there also is that indirect impact of the sort of the needs of the people living in city. Now, one of the other aspects of living in a city actually comes in the form of our density dependent factors. And we sort of talked about this in the context of COVID, but we've seen the urbanization of Europe as a great sort of way to usher in some pretty nasty epidemics. So for instance, the Black Death was before the meaningful urbanization, but following the urbanization of Europe, we saw massive outbreaks of tuberculosis, cholera, flu, any number of diseases you can think. The cities as a whole invite the sort of the spread of diseases like that, because again, cities are dense, and then something like a disease is a density dependent factor. Now, there's also the net negative health effects associated with living in a city. And we'll talk about this, what we call the urban penalty. We'll talk about it today. We'll talk about it when we talk about air. We'll talk about it when we talk about climate change as well. But people that live in cities are subjected to, relatively speaking, relative to the outlying suburbs or even the rural areas of an area of a town or a state or a country, is they suffer severe, much more severe health impacts of living in a city than someone who doesn't live in a city. Now, have we developed sanitation and better fuel standards and stuff like that? Yes. But the reality is the urban penalty is still very much alive and well. And actually, we see the urban penalty pretty heavily in effect actually right now. So today's a great example of when the urban heat penalty really takes off. So today and yesterday, it's above 90 degrees here in Massachusetts, which is defined as really high heat in Massachusetts. Obviously not for like the southern states, but here in Massachusetts, it's defined as really high heat. And here in Massachusetts, people that live in the city, they suffer about temperatures about 15 degrees hotter than the surrounding suburbs. Why? Well, concrete traps a lot of heat, makes the city significantly hotter than the suburbs, makes air pollution and the effects of bad air significantly worse. So the urban impact is, and the urban penalty is really, really no joke. It really isn't. It's it's a tough place to live. Is it a fun place to live? Absolutely. But the urban area does pose some challenges that human biology really has never really faced before. Now, why do people live in cities? Well, the reality is cities, they're economic centers, right? So there's no shortage of economic opportunities for the people who try to move to the cities, provided they can afford to live in the cities. Though I was reading this article this morning about how those that make the minimum wage, whether it's the minimum wage here in Massachusetts or the federal minimum wage, simply cannot afford to live in most cities at the way it is. So kind of an interesting conundrum. Lots of economic opportunity, but the cost of living in a city is obviously significantly higher than it is to not live in a city. Now, interestingly, when you start to do the numbers, if a person moves into a city with twice the number of people than their previous city, that person is likely to earn about 15% more income due to the essentially what we would say, the networks or connections that have been made to and lead to greater economic opportunities. So, if you live in Boston, you're likely to make more money. Live and work in Boston, you'll make more money than, say, if you lived in Detroit, which is about half the size of Boston. So, kind of interesting conundrum. But the other interesting thing we see is that an increase in urban density actually results in a net benefit to an economy that is basically of scale. And you guys probably have a pretty good grasp on what I mean by that, but essentially where the cost per capita per services decreases as a result of increasing scale of operations. So as you have more and more people to buy a product or that need some aspect of the economy, as you scale that up, the cost of scaling that up potentially has the ability to go down. It's kind of interesting economic sort of implications of expanding urban areas. But as you guys probably know, when you go into a city, shared resources become a much bigger thing. So like I live on a road that's got maybe, I don't know, I'll say 15 houses on it. And it's a pretty big size of land. It's about 10 to 15, no, probably closer to 30 acres, the parcel of land that my neighborhood sits on, 30 acres, which is a pretty sizable piece of land. And there's only a limited number of us that share the resource that is my road. But when you think about a city, the shared infrastructure of a city is enormous, right? How many people take the MBTA into Boston every day? How many people hop on our roads that go into Boston every day? Astronomically high amounts. So we have this sort of interesting graph here on the left, where we have developed countries and developing countries, where we have per capita emissions, and then we have national emissions, and then city emissions. And you can see really pretty starkly that national emissions are much higher than city-based emissions in most of the United States here, as well as in other places like Tokyo, London, so on and so forth. But then we switch to developing countries where the national emissions are actually sometimes lower than the city-based emissions. So cities produce a ton of sort of taxing emissions as a result of sort of their increased economic activity, their increased population densities, and so on and so forth. Now, why is this the case? Well, some people argue that efficiency gains, i.e., if you're developed, you have higher efficiency in terms of the resources that you use, as well as this leads to a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that's sort of one aspect of it. But you can also think that if you're living in a less well-off city, you're more likely to use cheaper energy sources such as coal to power your city, right? Which would lead to more emissions. So kind of an interesting phenomenon where, again, we can have cities being either net good or net bad. Well, that's probably the wrong way to say that. Less polluting or more polluting depending on how developed the country is. Now, I think Denver poses an interesting scenario here, because Denver is a pretty heavily up and coming city where its city emissions are essentially about equal with per capita emissions across the country, relative to say something like Chicago or Houston or Los Angeles, which are far more settled in cities. I'll use that word, settled in. I think that's a pretty good way of saying it. So this leads us to an interesting part of cities. Now, this is not something that's unique to any one part of the world, but we have slums. Now, for instance, we have the Dhawarni settlement in Mumbai, India. You could sort of see this sort of lower economic area. There's about 600,000 people living in this, essentially this maze of shacks and cheaply put together infrastructure that's about 1 square mile. You can see it in direct contrast to the rest of Mumbai, which is a pretty large city as is. Now, when you think about something like Davari, it's basically has no plumbing. That's not a Davari unique thing. Plumbing is a big issue in India at the moment in time, but indoor plumbing in this area is non-existent. There's open sewer ditches and that pollute people's houses. So it's very much like, like Europe in the 1800s, right? Where people were, refuse was in the street and people were living in small houses and stuff like that. And I bring this up not to sort of shame anything or anything like that, but this is sort of the reality of living in cities sometimes, that we have up and coming places like Dharavati, sorry, my pronunciation, even of English words is terrible, let alone words from other countries. But it leads to some really sort of not so fun situations like this. And the example here in the United States I'd actually like to give an example of is actually La Perla in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And so a couple of years ago, I was here with my wife. For those of you that have ever been to San Juan, it's an awesome city. But my wife and I were actually walking down this road here, and we're walking down the road. I think we were eating ice cream because it's Puerto Rico, so it was really hot. And we're walking. We can see these really colorful buildings over the side, and we're like, oh, and there's a wall here because military, former military installation, and you sort of get down and you start to see some of these houses, and then you sort of get into these areas, and you can see these again. This slum-like area of Puerto Rico, this territory of the United States, and the reality of a place like this here in San Juan or in India or any of the other slums that exist across is it actually poses not just like health issues, but also some pretty severe future issues. So you could think of like a place like this where it's right on the coast of Puerto Rico, very, very low-lying area, backed up against a hard wall, that any future changes to sea level, any large storm, that these already not so well-off people are going to be even worse off as sort of things change. So I bring up slums as a way to sort of show you that cities have lots of good things, right? Lots of economic opportunity in them, but there's also lots of people that struggle in them. And some of the struggles are just not really things we think characteristic of large cities, right? We think of, at least for a lot of people, we think large cities. We think of cities like New York and Beijing and Tokyo, like looking really nice. Like for instance, as we see here in the back of San Juan, relatively large city, relatively nice, right? Lots of restaurants, shops, and then you sort of step down about 50 feet, and again, you enter this area that's not doing well economically. So cities are sort of this mixed bag of places that invite economic opportunity, but also stifle the economic opportunities of some people as well. And clearly the environmental impacts here will be interesting to track going forward because again, of how low this is and the sort of the impending effects of climate change here. But let's move on from slums. I'll let you read this on your own. You can take a peek at some of the slums. Let's move on to sort of how development occurs, essentially economic opportunities, how social cities provide for others. Now, those that live in sort of not so fun areas or even that come to cities as refugees, they often do times because, again, fantastic economic opportunities are found in cities. Now, there's actually this really interesting perception. It's a psychological phenomenon called the bright light syndrome. And it's a really interesting thing where people actually see cities are places of great economic opportunity and freedom to pursue all aspects of life, even if, again, you're living in an area that's not doing so well, like, say, this area of Puerto Rico. It's kind of an interesting thing. Now, one of the other things that happens to develop in cities is the informal economy. So I have a friend that's over in Africa right now. She's in Liberia. It's one of the, unfortunately, one of the poorest areas of the world. Her husband does diplomatic security, so he escorts politicians and stuff like that. So he's kind of a cool dude in that sense. But they live in Liberia, one of the poorest cities, and in there, the economy of Liberia is pretty bad. And one of the reasons the economy of Liberia is pretty bad is they actually have this really strong informal economy. Now, what is the informal economy? Well, it's an economy that I sell, say, something on the side of the road, but I don't pay taxes, right? And we see that pretty commonly across numerous cities across the planet. Some cities, like in those in Liberia, strictly depend on this informal economy as ways for people to make their means. So kind of an interesting thing that you see developing in cities as well. I thought you guys would be interested in sort of that aspect of urbanization as a topic, or I don't know, maybe not. I thought it was kind of cool. Now, this leads us to what we call the suburban sprawl. I think it's a fun little slogan to say, but it's basically the spread of urban populations away from the centers of cities to widely disperse, essentially into areas that have relatively low population densities. And so we can see here in Las Vegas, sort of the sprawl away from the bright lights of the cities, allowing people to live outside of the city, but still take advantage of the city as a sort of an economic resource. Clearly, this is very, very different from the Las Vegas Strip, right? Where you have, no bright lights, you have, less roads, significantly lower population densities, and significantly different environmental and social challenges as well. Now we can look at this sort of across the United States. Now we can look at all the different cities. So we can see Boston here, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. So some of the oldest cities in the nation. And you see it to extent out here in California, but we'll focus on some of the older cities here. But you can sort of see that this really shift that started happening in the 1980s, where workers were less likely to live in the cities by which they were working in, and thus, and instead sprawled away from the city. So you can sort of see the lights here of the United States, whether it's here, Chicago, any of the big cities around, Houston, Dallas, so on and so forth, where it's the lights of the city, those strong lights, that urban sprawl of people moving out of the city, but still, again, continue to use the metropolitan area of Boston, New York, so on and so forth, essentially for economic opportunity and things of that nature. It's kind of a fun thing that I sort of an overlooked thing when people look at the maps like this, that you can see that urban sprawl of people leaving cities. And just to sort of to give you some numbers behind that, when you sort of look at the amount of people that take the MBTA in, so the Massachusetts, commuter rail, buses, trains, about 1 million to 1.5 million people, pre-COVID time, of course, hop on the MBTA every day and head into Boston. And that's just Boston, right? And that's not, thinking about larger cities like Philadelphia or New York or DC, right? 1 million to 1.5 million. Again, it varies, but a huge amount of people come into the city. And how do they do that? Well, again, they take advantage of the urban sprawl, spreading out from Boston. And the other thing you guys probably also know is that as you move away from the city, things also tend to get a bit cheaper, right? Housing gets cheaper, food gets cheaper, stuff gets cheaper. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Now, what are some of the characteristics of this sprawl? Well, clearly it's going from city, which has its own environmental issues, but encroaching on natural areas, right? So there does have a cost of living a cost to the environment by leaving the city. But again, there's still the impact of the city, and there's still the impact of people living in the city. But when we have suburbs start to develop, they have developed into what we typically call one-use zones, or distinct zones that have one specific purpose. Now we have this residential. There's shopping centers, office parks, schools, commercial, governmental, whatever you want to call them. You have a development of the suburban area into distinct zoning areas. And so we sort of see these sort of distinct types of situations developing. We're seeing a lot more of these two develop. So, historically it was like building single family houses, but now we're actually seeing more suburban areas developing, 30 unit areas, multi, large buildings in suburban areas. So for instance, like I mentioned before, I lived in Easton. Up the street from where I live, there's a brand new apartment complex. It's really expensive for whatever reason, but it's multi-family units spreading out over this small area by near where I live. And again, so we're seeing shifting from this more towards more of a city sort of vibe, but again, still not urban. It's kind of a thing. Now, as I mentioned, spreading out's not always so good, right? The city has its own taxes on the environment in terms of issues, but the sprawl, as it sort of happens, it takes land that was nice and happy and healthy. Maybe it was farmland, maybe it was natural forest, prairies, grasslands, whatever you think it is. And it does change that land usage, right? Converts it from natural to human-based land uses. And as that happens, it does affect the environment. But as you move away from the city, it does require you to consume more resources, right? If you think about the Boston metropolitan area, we have the MBTA, right? We have the subway, the trains, so on and so forth. But when we come out here to Easton, where I live, there's no public transportation system. You're relying upon your cars, less walking, less biking. People are consuming more resources per capita, driving more than in the city. So there is issues, environmental issues of also living in a suburban lifestyle that don't exist in the city, right? You're more likely to walk in the city or take the subway versus driving a car in the city. Now, the other thing that we oftentimes see is the air is significantly cleaner. So, for instance, Atlanta is a city that's always breaking federal regulation standards. But if you go into Atlanta, the air quality is typically not very good, typically lower than the federal air quality standards. And then if you leave Atlanta and you go into suburbs, the air quality significantly improves. But we can ask the question, why is the air quality in Atlanta so bad? Well, there's policies there, but one of the big issues of cities is people drive into cities. As you drive into cities, there's more air pollution from your car in the cities, thus making cities overall less healthy than the surrounding suburbs. So again, kind of interesting playback between the cities and the suburbs. And I'm actually going to skip this one because I don't really think it's necessary. But if you want to take a peek at transportation and streets, definitely do. It's kind of interesting sort of little slide there. So now we can ask the question, how did the suburban sprawl develop? Now, this really took off after World War II. So the baby boom, so my parents' generation, maybe your grandparents' generation. But basically, after the baby boom, about 10 million new houses were created between 1945 and 1955, which is an astronomical amount of houses. If that number of houses was being made today, there wouldn't be a housing crisis in places like here in Massachusetts or maybe Vancouver in British Columbia. We don't make even close to that many houses nowadays. But the mass production of these houses, sometimes just cookie cutter houses, houses that are in a neighborhood that are all identical, did allow people to essentially moving up. I'm sure you guys probably heard moving on up, right? That idea of moving up in class status, and that also equated here in the United States to the urban-suburban sprawl, i.e. moving out of cities and into the suburbs of cities. It's kind of a cool history fact. I don't know if you guys like history. I like history, but so I always think that's kind of a cool thing. And from there, we created some zoning to keep residential areas, to keep the pollution of heavy industry away, but also some not so fun things from American history, such as segregation from class, race, ethnicity, as well as religion. There's unfortunately very few times in the United States history where race doesn't factor in negatively in some way, shape, or form. And their suburban sprawl certainly had its play and had its thing to say about how race factored in as well. So it is what it is. But as I mentioned, and you can sort of take a peek at this sort of, if you're, the sort of idea interests you of how race sort of fits into the suburban sprawl as well. It's kind of interesting thing, but I'll leave it there for you guys to take a peek at. Now, with the suburban sprawl and with sort of this, it led to some differing building policies. Now, when the FHA, so the First Time Homeowners Association, as well as the VA, did guarantee loans made by private banks to homeowners starting in the 30s and 40s, that was kind of a big thing. So for instance, like I just bought my first house last year. My loan was through a private bank, is secured by the FHA loan. I have a friend that's former military. His loan is secured by the VA, so the Veterans Administration. And so that allowed people to essentially to be able to buy houses, right? You think about buying houses modern times, it's kind of a risky thing, $500,000 for a piece of land and a house on it. It's a lot of money. Doesn't really matter who it is in terms of investment. No one wants to lose $500,000 of cash, but this allowed people to allowed homeownership to become significantly more affordable, significantly less risky. but also led to the large developmental companies that have been emerging and organizing actually kickouts of previously, I'm sorry, that more, sorry, that large development companies emerged and actually organized some pretty cool like little kits of pre-cut materials to quickly assemble houses. So if you've ever been to, for instance, like I grew up outside of Dallas for a little bit of time. Every house in my neighborhood was almost identical because a single development company was just producing all these materials in mass and assembling the houses in mass outside of Dallas, Texas. So again, some kind of cool like building things that came out. Now, one of the sort of the biggest transport infrastructural things that have come out of change in the way we live is the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1956, which provided an astronomical amount of money at the time. Not so much nowadays, but a pretty high price tag at the time, $26 billion for funding more than 41,000 miles of roadways throughout the country. So development of our modern day highway system, kind of a, oops, sorry about that, kind of a cool thing. People don't, we sort of take our highways and stuff like that for granted, but you know, before this highway act, we were super cut off from one another, but it really opened up American roadways, opened up cities, opened up suburbs, stuff like that, allow people to get in and out of cities faster, allow people to go between states much faster, open up the economy, and so on and so forth. Kind of a really cool thing. And just to put that 41,000 miles into perspective, that's about 4 times the circumference of the Earth, the Earth's circumference of the, I'm sorry, twice the circumference of the Earth. So it's pretty dang high amount of mileages you could drive in the United States just on highways. So now, from there, as the sprawl continued, as we sort of left the cities, our purchasing patterns have significantly changed in terms of how we use goods and how much space we physically wanted. So, for instance, houses purchased and built in the 1950s are generally significantly smaller than they are nowadays. So for instance, my house was built in the early 90s. It's about 2,000 square feet. But we did look at some houses at the time that were built in the 1950s, and they were teeny tiny, about 1,000 square feet. So again, humans like big spaces, but our consumption patterns have changes, right? Bigger and better. That sort of adage holds true, not just for things we do, but also the houses and things like that we buy. Kind of an interesting I don't know, interesting history thing, at least in my opinion. Now, as we sort of move back into the cities, there's been some interesting changes. Now, you guys probably know cities are pretty characteristic for big buildings, right? High rises, things of that matter. And that's sort of one of the things that cities are known for, being, less green space. But we actually know that a lot of places are actually starting to take better advantage of incorporating green space, higher connectivity, and things that influence community interactions that essentially are meaningful and useful. So for instance, urban planners in the New York City's High Line, that plan New York City's High Line. So you can sort of see it here. We have these buildings, green areas above the ground, right? Things that influence people to come together in green spaces and things like that, eat, drink, all that fun stuff. Changing, sort of the consumption patterns of people and the desires of people living in cities are also changing, leading to, sort of going away from just strictly skyscrapers to being a more interconnected, greener area, far more interactions between people. Now, let's talk a little bit about urban planning. Now, urban planning is kind of an interesting thing because I'm from Massachusetts, and many of you are also probably from Massachusetts, and you go into Boston, and Boston just kind of looks like a mismatch of streets put together, right? There's streets that have the same name twice, right? There's streets that are windy. There's streets that are one ways, right? And so when I think of urban planning as a Bostonian, I think of urban planning as just kind of a crap show, right? Just bad. But the reality is, when we actually start to look at more modern cities, New York City, we look at, in this case, we have Kansas City, Missouri, we look at Dallas, we see some pretty heavy amounts of planning that went into building these cities. And I think it's truly remarkable when you look at a picture like this, at how square it is and how well put together and how laid out this city is, what urban planning went into it. Now, what are the challenges with planning things? Well, clearly there's an environmental impact, but there is also concerns of the well-being of residents, because the daily activity of those in the city does affect those in the surrounding area, both environmentally speaking as well as economically. Now, in the 80s, our friends at the World Bank did fund a regional plan in Mumbai, India, to upgrade their slum conditions for more than 100,000 dwellings. Without the participation of the slum dwellers, which actually resulted in 10 years of failed implementation. So they had all sorts of good things at heart at the time, but without the sort of the incorporation of the local people, it simply just did not come into being. Now, this sort of failed urban planning is sort of a good example of what not to do. But the reality is there's a need when you're sort of planning things at the local level to incorporate both environmental policy as well as the local well-being of others in the region, as a sort of baseline for having to make a city better, to make a city greener, and things like that. Now, the cities, while they're sort of their own monster in on themselves, cities are not separate from the environment. Now, how we can ask the question, how do cities respond when there's a disaster? Now, we can look recently to a not so great natural disaster in 2005. I'm sure many of you probably heard of Hurricane Katrina. The effects of Hurricane Katrina are still felt in many parts of the South, even to this day, even after 16 years. But the city of New Orleans has, which is pretty heavily hit by a hurricane, Katrina obviously, led to the death of thousands and the displacement of tens of thousands of people due to essentially the poor urban planning and the poor construction of not only their buildings, but also their levees, as well as the pretty severe economic inequalities that existed throughout the city. Now, why did New Orleans as a city fail? I mean, the levees obviously did not help with the stormwater there, but the failed prior city planning was really left the city ill-equipped for evacuation, emergency response, as well as just the structure of their buildings as a whole. Now, what did New Orleans do following Hurricane Katrina? Well, they actually put some pretty interesting economic and building plans into focus. Now, they had sort of this idea of, and I think this really it's really kind of a great representation of it, to make New Orleans a much more resilient city, a much more inclusive city, a much more green space. And the big thing with New Orleans was allowing more wetlands into their area. As we'll talk about later in the semester, wetlands are great for mitigating the effects of stormwater. But New Orleans really, not super well, but decently well responded to a really awful environmental disaster by changing the way they plan their cities, changing the way their cities are organized, or their city, I should say, and trying to make it more environmental friendly, more environmentally resilient to future disasters as well. So New Orleans, pretty cool response to Hurricane Katrina, to obviously a horrible event, but again, brought some great innovation, some great city planning, and some great ways to think about how the environment factors into the development of their city. Now, let's talk about transportation, because the United States is nothing if not a well-connected country. Now, in the 90s, two governors, one from New Jersey, the other from Maryland, they had this really interesting quote that I really like. And they said, if you design communities for automobiles, you get more automobiles. If you design them for people, you get walkable, livable communities. And that's really a fantastic quote. I mean, it's a really important quote. And I like this comic here because it really illustrates it well. And got this person stuck in traffic across the United States, and yet traffic seems not be moving. With Canada and Mexico, we could add a few more lanes in each direction now. And I think for those of you that have ever lived in a city or lived near a city, traffic is a real issue, right? Transportation is important. It's not just vehicle transportation, right? Where we have this induced traffic effect across the United States, we have increased traffic congestion, which is oftentimes due to adding lanes to existing roads and highways, but also building highways that are not future-proof. Now, Massachusetts is a great example of not future-proof highways. We can look at I-93 in Massachusetts. It was not made for this many people to go on it. Thus, I-93 in Massachusetts pretty much always has traffic on it. Now, transportation is clearly important, but when we have massive amounts of we have roads and communities and structures built for the automobile, this leads to some serious environmental impacts. And we'll talk about the effects of cars on air pollution next week, but we'll also talk about the effects of cars on climate change in a few weeks. But again, clearly not a sustainable solution as it is right now. Now, there are clearly transportation alternatives. And so we can sort of look at so what this is. We have what's called the modal split, which we look at as the percentage of travelers in an area using a particular type of transportation. And so we can look at the modal split for cities, New York, Los Angeles, some of the biggest cities in the United States. Unfortunately, Boston is not on this list. But we do actually relatively good. We do pretty close to Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. But we can see something like New York, where they do pretty dang good, where they have 22% drive cars, 5 carpool, 56% are on transit, 1% bike, 10% walk, other, and then 4% work from home. Pretty cool split here in New York, but you can see other cities, like for instance, where's my friend Dallas here? Dallas, a city built for cars, very, very few people taking transportation otherwise, because Dallas, again, a pretty modern city, but a city built for cars. So the transportation concerns of cities are real, but as is the environmental impacts of these transportation choices, which again, we'll talk about soon. Now, let's talk about how transportation influences density, because I think it's a pretty cool thing. Now, city planning is obviously really important, but we think about how dense a city can get. It oftentimes is dependent on how good their public transportation is. So for instance, just to give you some numbers, a full bus can carry 70 passengers, but a single car can only carry, maybe 4 people at the same time. So there is a density issue. You carry, if there's more cars on the road, that means less people are going to be there. There's more buses on the road, more people can be there. But this really interesting thing that a study a couple of years ago showed that the average US bus only carries 10 passengers at a time. So it operates at 1/7 capacity. So we certainly could be doing better with our buses. But just put this in more perspective, streetcars and subway systems do much better, which have 46 to 24% capacity average. Though I feel like during rush hour, these numbers are close to 100% capacity or more than 100% capacity. But that's just me complaining about taking the train. Now, this really interesting thing, the better public transportation you have, the more people you can carry, which also leads to higher population densities. So you can think about something like Chicago. Really, there's about 3.5 million people in the Chicago area. Pretty dang good public transportation system in Chicago. Also fantastic hot dogs in Chicago. If you've never been, the Chicago hot dogs are my favorite. But you can see Chicago pretty high pretty high density of people, but also pretty high what we would call a walkability score. So this is a pretty cool little thing you can look at for pretty much every city out there. But you can see the central part of Chicago here, very, very high walkability for restaurants and stuff like that. So sometimes you don't need fully, sort of sprawled out transportation systems if walkability is a real thing. Now, sort of the last thing we'll talk about is how cities are changing. Now, cities have been around for a couple hundred years at this point. So how have cities changed? What are the sort of cities of the future going to look like? And that's kind of a hard question to answer because we obviously don't know what our human culture is going to be like in 50 years or 100 years if, climate change doesn't, push us to the brink before then. But what do we think cities are going to start looking like? Well, the reality is a lot of cities, and you can start to see this change happening in Nordic countries like Denmark and Sweden, where cities are really starting to promote what we call mixed use areas, where you have a mixture of housing, shops, restaurants, grocery stores, offices, and public transportations, all within a half mile of public transportation. So really great sort of thing, right? Getting less cars on the road, allowing people to walk more, to bike more, take the train more, bus more, whatever it is, but still be highly connected the way you would imagine with the city, but also allowing them to be in much greener spaces, to be in much cleaner spaces, air quality wise. It's kind of a really great thing that we're starting to see the future of some cities, though. Some cities haven't changed at all. Right? You can look at some of the monster cities in China, and they're very much not like this at all. So again, we think a lot of cities should be heading towards this, but the reality is we don't really know how that is going to be going. Now, we've talked about walkability, and has walkability should be is an important part of cities, but we also think walkability is likely to be more to be increased as in the cities of the future, with shorter city blocks, relatively narrow streets that we see in places like Chicago, New York, where walkability is a more favored mechanism of transportation, i.e. moving away from cars, which again potentially cleans up our airways, but also potentially developing what we call TODs, or transit-oriented development, which is basically design strategies to integrate public transportation and land use patterns in a more sustainable and resilient ways. Now, there's pedestrian-oriented development, or POD, which is a term to basically designate strategies to integrate pedestrian travel and land use patterns in a more sustainable, resilient ways. So for instance, Massachusetts has been trying to do this quite a bit. We have limited space here in the Boston area. And so we've actually been trying to push into more expansion of the MBTA, better expansion of, blue bikes, scooters, better buses, more on-time buses, trains, so on and so forth. So future of the city should be an interesting thing, and hopefully it will be a greener thing for overall, because as we sort of mentioned, the city poses some pretty severe biological challenges on individuals, as well as the organisms living in there, but we're mostly thinking about this the lens of humans. Now, we like to sort of talk about green infrastructure. That's kind of a hot button term now to describe basically a wide variety of way to incorporate green spaces into urban areas, including New York City's Central Park and Boston's sort of failed Emerald Necklace. You guys never heard of the Emerald Necklace of Boston? You should take a Google at it. It's kind of an interesting story. Lots of cool corruption and lots of failed promises, but definitely take a peek at it. But also the incorporation of some other things, maybe not like massive parks, but also potentially things like rooftops, right? Help improve heating and cooling, but also provide people with places to grow food, right? Or potentially, interactive places, bars, things like that. So, and sort of the last thing I'll make mention of before we'll call the end of today's class is actually some interesting what we call the Bullet Center. Now, the Bullet Center is a sort of interesting thing. And now it was designed by a gentleman named Miller Hull in Seattle, Washington. And they developed this building to be the greenest commercial building, and they sort of this really cool thing where it's got, again, it's a cool mixture of green space both on the ground and on the roof, and this great sort of incorporation of sustainable building and energy efficiency, and all these really cool things, but really to sort of tackle the problem of the modern city, because as we discussed, cities are only projected to get larger and larger and larger. So how do we tackle that? And some people think the future of the city looks more like this, though others argue that the future of the city looks pretty much like it does now, just larger and dirtier and more or less business as usual. So it really depends on who you ask and what the future of the city is. But clearly, for the sake of the environment, clearly for the sake of human health, it would be much better for the city to look significantly more like this and less like sort of the cities that we've been seeing around, such as, meh buildings like that. So that's going to be the end of today's class. Let me stop. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to hang around or shoot me an email. But otherwise,